Once upon a time, in a grand and prosperous kingdom, there lived a carpenter unlike any other. His hands, roughened by years of labor, had crafted the finest homes, the sturdiest bridges, and even the king's own palace. For decades, his work had shaped the very bones of the kingdom. Nobles whispered his name with admiration, and common folk gazed in awe at his craftsmanship. No nail was ever misplaced, no beam ever crooked. If he built it, it stood the test of time. The king himself had trusted this man with every great project, and the carpenter had served faithfully, pouring his heart and soul into every plank, every carving, every stroke of his chisel. But years had passed. His once steady hands now trembled. His back, once strong as oak, ached with every dawn. He had spent a lifetime building homes for others, yet now all he longed for was a simple life, a quiet home of his own where he could grow vegetables, raise chickens, and tell stories to his grandchildren. And so, one day, he made a decision. It was time to lay down his tools. The carpenter stood in his humble workshop, running a calloused hand over a beam of polished oak. Once, the scent of fresh-cut wood filled him with excitement. Now, it only reminded him of the years slipping through his fingers like sawdust in the wind. He was tired, not just in his bones, but in his soul. He had spent a lifetime shaping the kingdom, but what of his own life? His grandchildren barely knew him beyond the scent of timber and the sound of hammering. His wife, patient as the sun, had grown old waiting for him to come home early, just once. No more, he thought. It was time. The next morning he dressed in his best tunic, one rarely worn, for his days were spent in work clothes stained with varnish and sweat. He made his way to the palace, a place he knew as well as his own workshop. The halls gleamed, the pillars stood tall, the doors never creaked, because he had built them all. As he stepped into the throne room, the king was seated upon his grand golden chair, surveying matters of the kingdom. When the carpenter entered, the king's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, my finest builder," the king greeted warmly. "What brings you here, old friend?" The carpenter took a deep breath. "Your Majesty," he said, voice steady but weary, "I have given my life to shaping this kingdom, and I have been honored to do so, but now I wish to retire, to go home, tend to my garden, raise my chickens, and tell stories to my grandchildren while I still have time." The room fell silent. The king studied him for a long moment, fingers tapping against the armrest of his throne. Then the king smiled, a smile the carpenter could not quite decipher. "Oh," the king said, his voice rich with amusement. "So, you are strong enough to grow vegetables and chase chickens, but not strong enough to build one last house for me?" The carpenter blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Well, gardening is easier on my back than carpentry, Your Majesty," he admitted with a small chuckle. The king leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "I see, but before I grant your wish, I have just one last favor to ask." The carpenter's heart sank. He should have known. "Build me one final house," the king said, his voice warm yet firm. "Make it the masterpiece of your life." The carpenter swallowed hard. A masterpiece? At his age? He glanced at his hands. Hands that had once carved beauty from raw timber with effortless grace. Now, they ached at the mere thought of lifting a hammer. For a brief moment, he considered refusing, but one did not simply refuse a king. "So," he nodded, "as you wish, Your Majesty." Yet, deep inside, he muttered to himself, "A masterpiece? Why not let the younger craftsman handle it?" He did not know it yet, but this final project would change his life forever. The carpenter stood before the king, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from weakness, but from the weight of unspoken thoughts. He had come seeking rest, yet here he was, burdened with one final task. He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, I have dedicated my youth to building this kingdom. Now, I only wish to retire, grow vegetables, raise chickens, and enjoy life with my grandchildren." The king leaned back in his throne, his fingers steepled. His expression was unreadable, save for the faintest glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Oh," the king said, feigning surprise. "So, you are strong enough to tend a garden and chase chickens, but not strong enough to build one last house for me?" The carpenter stiffened. It was a clever trap, one wrapped in silk, but lined with iron. Well, gardening is easier on my back than carpentry, Your Majesty." He forced a chuckle, but it came out dry. The king nodded, as if considering. Then his gaze sharpened. "I see. But before you retire, do me one last favor. Build me one final house. Make it the masterpiece of your life." A masterpiece. The word landed like a heavy brick in the pit of the carpenter's stomach. His fingers twitched at his sides. Once he would have relished the challenge. Once he would have spent months selecting the finest wood, carving every beam with care, ensuring perfection in every detail. But now his heart was not in it. His mind was already in his future garden, his hands itching to hold not a hammer, but a handful of rich soil. Still, he was no fool. A request from the king was not a request at all. So he bowed low, though his spirit remained heavy. "As you wish, Your Majesty." Yet as he turned to leave, he could not help but mutter under his breath, "A masterpiece. Why not have the younger men do it?" He did not see the way the king smiled then, slow and knowing, as if he already foresaw what was to come. The sun hung low in the sky as the carpenter trudged back to his workshop, his mind clouded with reluctant thoughts. He had built countless homes in his lifetime, each one a work of dedication, a testament to his skill. But this was different. This was not a project of passion. This was an obstacle between him and the peaceful days he had dreamed of. That night, as he sat by the dim glow of an oil lamp, his wife noticed the tension in his brow. She had seen that look before, the look of a man bound by duty, wrestling with his own desires. "What troubles you?" she asked gently. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "The king has asked me to build one last house before I retire." She tilted her head. "One last house? That should be an honor." "An honor?" He let out a dry chuckle. "An honor would be letting me go in peace. This is a test, a final hurdle before I can put down my tools for good." His wife studied him for a moment, then smiled. A soft, knowing smile. "Then finish it quickly," she said. "If this is the last thing standing between you and the life you want, build it and be done with it." The carpenter stared at her, considering her words. Perhaps she was right. Yes, he would build the house, but not with the fire of his youth, not with the care that once defined him. He would build it quickly. He would cut a few corners, use what was available, and finish it in half the time. What did it matter? The king had palaces. This was just another house among many. The sooner he finished, the sooner he would be free. And so, the next morning, with a weary sigh, he gathered his apprentices, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work. Yet, deep in the corners of his heart, something unsettled stirred, like the first creak of an old wooden beam before it begins to crack. The morning air was crisp as the carpenter and his apprentices arrived at the construction site. The land was well chosen, perched on a gentle hill, with a view of golden fields stretching toward the horizon. A house built here could have been a masterpiece, a place of beauty and strength. But the carpenter had no such intentions. He glanced at the neat stacks of fine timber and polished stone provided for the project. Materials fit for a king's request. But instead of reaching for them, he turned to his apprentices and waved a dismissive hand. "Why bother with the best wood?" he muttered. "A cheaper one will do. The king won't be living here anyway." His apprentices exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a young man with bright eyes and a cautious heart, hesitated. "Master, this wood is thin. If it gets wet, the house might not last through the seasons." The carpenter let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Then whoever lives here will get a thrilling experience every time the wind blows, won't they?" Some of the apprentices chuckled nervously, unsure whether he was joking. The young man, however, did not laugh. He had worked under the carpenter long enough to know that once the master would have rejected anything less than perfect. Once he would have spent days choosing the right grain, ensuring that the wood would hold firm against time itself. But today, that man was gone. The carpenter ordered them to use the cheaper materials. Where he once measured twice and cut once, he now rushed. Where he once cared, he now shrugged. The foundation was laid, but it lacked its usual precision. The beams were erected, but some wobbled slightly as they stood. No one dared to question him further. Yet, as the house took shape, so too did an invisible unease. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the scent of damp wood left too long in the rain. The house rose quickly, but not with the quiet dignity of a well-built home. Instead, it stood like a hastily assembled stage prop, impressive from afar but hollow within. The carpenter, once a man who could spend hours carving the perfect arch or aligning each beam with the patience of a poet, now moved with indifference. His hands, still steady, worked not with love, but with a singular goal: to finish as quickly as possible. One afternoon, as the structure neared completion, his young apprentice hesitated by the half-finished walls, running his fingers over the plain, rough surface. "Master," the boy said hesitantly, "aren't you going to carve the beams? You always used to add such beautiful details, patterns of vines, birds, the stories of the kingdom." The carpenter scoffed. "Oh, come on," he muttered. "People need a house to live in, not to admire wooden carvings. The roof will keep the rain out, and that's enough." The boy frowned, still tracing the lifeless wood beneath his fingers. "But the houses you built before, they weren't just strong. They were alive. They told stories. People looked at them and felt something." The carpenter wiped sweat from his brow, sighing. "Look, lad," he said, not unkindly, "I used to believe that too. But people don't see those things. They don't care. They just want a roof, some walls, and a door that doesn't creak." The boy opened his mouth as if to argue, but closed it again. There was no point. This was not the same man who had once taught him to shape wood, as if breathing life into it. Later that evening, when the others had gone, the boy remained behind, staring at the unfinished railing of the house's balcony. He imagined how, in the past, his master would have carved intricate spirals into it, patterns of waves or climbing ivy, something that would make the house not just a shelter, but a home. Now it was just plain wood, a railing, nothing more. And yet something in the night wind seemed to whisper a warning, rustling through the unfinished beams as if sighing in disappointment. The carpenter didn't hear it, or maybe he simply chose not to listen. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing one the house grew taller, its walls standing firm, or at least appearing to. From the outside it looked fine, even respectable. A casual observer might even call it a fine piece of work. But the carpenter knew better. He saw the imperfections hidden beneath the surface, the misaligned beams, the gaps hastily patched with weak mortar, the wood that, though polished on the outside, would not withstand the bite of time. And yet, when he stood back and wiped the sweat from his brow, he felt no pride, only relief. "Done," he muttered to himself. Finally, done. He turned to his apprentices who had been watching him with quiet unease. "Pack up the tools," he ordered. "We're finished here." The young apprentice, the one who had questioned him before, hesitated. His eyes traced the structure, the way the windows were slightly off-center, the faint unevenness of the roof, the cracks already forming in the hastily mixed plaster. "Master," the boy began carefully, "are you sure?" But the carpenter silenced him with a sharp wave of his hand. "It looks fine, doesn't it?" he snapped. "That's all that matters." The boy pressed his lips together but said nothing more. That evening, as the sun cast its final golden glow over the newly completed house, the carpenter allowed himself one last look. It stood there, quiet and still. It did not speak to him like his previous creations. It did not whisper of craftsmanship, of pride, of a legacy built with care. It was just a house, nothing more. And with that, he turned his back on it, eager to leave it behind and finally embrace the retirement he had longed for. Little did he know, his work was not done. Not yet. The grand hall of the palace was bathed in golden light when the carpenter arrived, his heart lighter than it had been in years. This was it, the final moment. He walked with a briskness that defied his age, the key to the house clutched in his calloused palm. The weight of duty was about to be lifted. At the far end of the hall, the king stood waiting, dressed in robes of deep crimson, his crown gleaming under the chandeliers. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something the carpenter, in his eagerness to be free, failed to notice. The old man knelt respectfully and extended the key with both hands. "Your Majesty, the house is complete," he announced, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I shall take my leave and return to my farm." The king reached out, but instead of taking the key, he folded his hands behind his back and smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "Good," he said. "Then here is your reward." The carpenter frowned. Reward? He hadn't expected anything, nor did he want anything. All he wanted was to leave, to put this place behind him. But before he could speak, the king continued, his voice rich with something almost playful. "This house," the king said, "is my gift to you for your years of service." Silence fell over the hall. For a long moment, the carpenter simply stared, the words not fully sinking in. Then, a strange sensation crept up his spine, like the slow tightening of a rope around his chest. "What?" His voice came out hoarse, almost breathless. The king gestured toward the key, still resting in the carpenter's trembling hands. "It is yours," he said lightly, "a place to enjoy your retirement, a home built by your own hands." A sickening weight settled in the carpenter's stomach. His fingers clenched around the key as his mind raced back to the cheap wood, the shortcuts, the missing details, the weak foundation hidden beneath the polished surface. He had built many homes in his life, but this was the first he had built without care. And now he had to live in it. His mouth went dry. "Your Majesty," he stammered, forcing a smile, Perhaps another house would be more suitable. This one, well, it was built in haste, I could—" But the king cut him off with a knowing look. "No," the king said, his voice gentle but firm. "You built this house with your own hands, Master Carpenter. I would not take from you what you have earned." The words landed like stones in his gut. The carpenter swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. His knees suddenly felt weak, his breath uneven. He turned, looking at the key in his palm as if it burned him. For the first time, he truly saw what he had done. And deep in his chest, regret bloomed like an unforgiving storm. The carpenter stood frozen, the weight of the key pressing into his palm like an iron brand. His mouth opened, then closed. Words failed him. The king smiled. Oh, it was a kind smile, yet beneath it lay something sharp, something knowing. "Well," the king said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man bestowing a great honor, "shall we visit your new home?" The carpenter's breath hitched. He wanted to protest, to beg for another chance, to say that this house wasn't meant for him, that it wasn't good enough, not for a man like him, a man who had once been proud of his work. But he could already see the answer in the king's eyes. No, there would be no second chances. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck as he forced his lips into something resembling a smile. Of course, Your Majesty." And so, with the weight of his mistakes pressing against his chest, the carpenter followed the king's carriage through the winding streets of the kingdom. When they arrived, the house stood before him, bathed in the light of the setting sun. To any outsider, it looked fine, grand even, a house befitting a man of his skill. But the carpenter knew better. He saw the weak beams, the cheap wood, the walls that would crack with the first heavy rain. He saw every flaw he had ignored, every shortcut he had taken, every mistake he had allowed. This house would not last, and now neither would his peace. The king stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go on," he said. "Enjoy the home you have built for yourself." The carpenter swallowed. Slowly, he stepped forward, lifted the key with fingers that suddenly felt far too clumsy, and fitted into the lock. With a soft click, the door swung open. A gust of wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of sawdust and unfinished work. His heart clenched. For the rest of his days, he would live in this house, not just within its walls, but within the lesson it carried. A lesson built by his own hands. Behind him, his young apprentice chuckled under his breath. "Looks like you played yourself this time, master." The carpenter closed his eyes. Oh, how right the boy was. The carpenter stood in the dimming light, staring at the house that was now his final work, his last project, his burden to bear. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly as they clutched the key. The weight of his own choices pressed down on him like an anvil. He could not change the past. He could not undo the shortcuts he had taken, the carelessness he had allowed. And yet, what choice did he have now but to accept it? With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked under his boots, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty space. He ran his fingers along the walls, rough, unfinished. The nails were not hammered in properly. The beams above him sagged ever so slightly. A cold breeze slipped through an unseen crack, whispering of the weakness hidden beneath the surface. This was not the work of a master carpenter. It was the work of a man who had given up. And now this was his home. His stomach twisted, but he swallowed the bitter taste of regret and turned to the king, who still stood at the doorway, watching him with a quiet, knowing expression. "Thank you, Your Majesty," the carpenter said at last, his voice quieter than he intended. The king nodded, satisfaction flickering in his gaze. "A man should always live in the house he builds for himself," he said simply. "I trust you will take good care of it." With that, the king turned and left, his royal robes sweeping behind him like the final stroke of an artist's brush. The carpenter stood alone in the dim light of his new home, staring at the walls he had built with his own neglect. And for the first time in his life, he understood the true weight of his work. The carpenter slumped onto the lone wooden stool in the center of his new home. His fingers traced the grooves on the table, rough, uneven. He had once taken pride in the smoothness of his work, the way his hands could turn ordinary wood into something strong, something lasting. But this was different. He glanced around. The walls, though standing, had a slight tilt, almost imperceptible, but he knew it was there. The corners where beams met should have been seamless, but instead they gaped just slightly, whispering of rushed measurements and careless fittings. The roof above him creaked softly in the night breeze, a quiet reminder that he had taken shortcuts. He swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter," he told himself. "A house is just a house." But even as he tried to believe it, he couldn't ignore the gnawing unease in his chest. He stood, walking to the window. Outside, the moon bathed the village in silver light, and in the distance he could see the grand structures he had built in his prime. The king's palace, the noble estates, the bridges that connected the kingdom. Those had been his legacy. Now he had built himself a house that stood like a mockery of everything he once was. His fingers tightened around the window frame, and suddenly, crack! A sharp sound splintered through the silence. He yanked his hand away just as a jagged crack ran up the wood, splitting it like a scar. His breath hitched. The house was already breaking. His house. The weight of the realization hit him all at once, and for the first time, true regret sank into his bones. This was not just a house. It was the sum of his choices, his negligence, his own undoing. He had spent his whole life building homes for others with care, with precision, and when it finally came time to build one for himself, he had done so without heart, without patience. And now he would have to live in it. For a long moment, he stood in the dim light, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Then, without a word, he reached for his tools. If he had to live in this house, then he would fix it. One nail at a time. For nights on end, the old carpenter worked. His hands, once slow with age, found purpose again. He sanded the rough walls, reinforced the beams, sealed the cracks where the cold wind slithered through. He worked alone, under the soft glow of lantern light, with only the creak of wood and the sigh of the night as company. And as he worked, he thought about the years he had spent building homes for kings and nobles, about the pride he had once felt in his craft, and about the moment he had chosen to abandon it not because his hands had failed him, but because his heart had grown weary. But now, with every stroke of his chisel, with every nail driven deep, something stirred within him. He was no longer just repairing a house. He was rebuilding himself. Seasons passed. The house, once weak, now stood firm. It would never be a palace, nor a grand structure worthy of kings, but it was his, and it would endure. One evening, as he sat on the porch, his grandson ran up to him, eyes wide with wonder. "Grandpa, did you really build this house all by yourself?" The old man chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "I did, but not the first time." The child frowned. "What do you mean?" The carpenter gazed at the home he had once despised, the home that had taught him his greatest lesson. "Every task we do," he said softly, "is like building a house. If we cut corners, we will be the ones to live in the weakness we create. But if we build with care, with patience, with heart, then what we build will stand strong long after we are gone." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but one day he would. And with that, the old carpenter leaned back, watching the sunset bathe his home in golden light. He had built palaces for kings. But in the end, this humble house, born from failure but rebuilt with love, was the greatest thing he had ever made. Moral of the story? We all build our own house in life, through the choices we make, the effort we give, and the integrity we uphold. If we take shortcuts, we will be the ones to live with the consequences. But if we give our best, even in the smallest tasks, we will build something truly lasting. The end.